Okay, so I know this looks like a lot of graphs, but bear with me because we're going to walk through it. This is the snap check that I posted last Friday that a lot of you had some trouble with, and so I wanted to sort of take you through step by step what was going on here. So the question was, if we're in an increasing cost industry, is it true or false or uncertain? The more elastic the supply of the inputs, the more elastic the supply of outputs. So the first thing is to think about what we mean by an increasing cost industry. What's causing it? And what's causing an increase in cost industry, this is exactly the picture from, if you go back to the video just before this about adjustment to an increase in demand and an increase in cost industry. That works you through this whole process. So that should be familiar to you before you tackle this question. But now that you know what an increase in cost industry, you know an increase in cost industry, when firms enter in response to an increase in demand, it raises the cost of production. So this example I have here is we're making houses, and the more people that are making houses, the bigger the demand for plywood, and that raises the price of plywood. So it makes it more expensive for everybody to produce. And so as more firms enter, driving down the price of houses, because of greater supply, the cost of making houses is going up. And so we don't get as much entry as we would if it were a constant cost industry. And so we get a long run supply curve that is really elastic. It's pretty responsive, but it's not perfectly elastic. As demand goes up, the quantity supply goes up, but the price goes up a little bit because as firms enter, the cost of production go up a little bit. But this is when the supply of the input is pretty elastic. It's pretty responsive. So when more people want that good, when more people want plywood, yeah, the price goes up, but not that much. So the cost of production go up for everybody, but not that much. And so the price is a little bit higher when we get back to long run equilibrium, but not that much. So the supply, long run supply, is pretty responsive because a lot of firms can enter before price gets driven down to average cost, because entry drives price of inputs up, but not very much. So we get a pretty good amount of responsiveness. On the other hand, if we're in a situation where the input supply is really inelastic, so the same increase in demand drives the price of plywood way up, so more people want it and now the price of plywood's way higher, then it's going to increase costs a lot more. So firms see that profit, as we talked about before, but if the average cost goes up really high, then firms are going to start entering, driving price down, but there's not going to be very much room for entry before profit gets driven down to zero. Because as firms are entering, driving price down, they're all buying the plywood, and the plywood's getting so much more expensive that it raises the cost for everybody to produce. So it doesn't take very much entry at all until price gets driven down to minimum average cost. So yes, supply will increase, but not that much. And the increase in long run equilibrium price is going to be a lot higher. So when the supply of inputs to the industry is not very responsive, that means when more people want to enter, those inputs are going to be a lot more expensive. So costs are going to go up a lot with entry. So there's not going to be that much entry before profit goes to zero. And so our long run supply curve ends up being a lot less responsive. We don't get as much responsiveness in the long run, meaning we don't get as many firms entering in response to the increase in demand, because as they enter, it gets so much more expensive for everyone to produce. And so it is true. The more elastic the supply of inputs, the more firms can enter without driving the price up too much. So if the supply of input's pretty elastic, so if the supply of plywood's pretty elastic, a lot more people want to build houses, yeah, the price of plywood goes up a little, but it doesn't affect the price in the housing market very much. So the long run supply, the price doesn't come necessarily all the way back to where it was, but it comes pretty far down. There's a lot of responsiveness. But if if supply is really inelastic in the input industry, as firms start to enter, it gets so much more expensive to supply, average costs shift up so much that not very many firms can enter before profit gets driven down to zero. So the more elastic the input supply, the more responsive the input supply, the less price goes up when firms enter, so the less costs go up for the firms. And so there's more entry, there's more responsiveness in this market supply before profit gets driven down to zero.